inquiry going on live today. And I'm joined now in the studio by our political correspondent, Catherine Forster. Catherine, it gets worse and worse every day. We know now that the Post Office is guilty. We know there have been serious errors. Two big questions I have for you. Who should foot the bill? And should some of these Post Office staff be put in jail?
Well, very good questions. In terms of who should foot the bill, I think to begin with, the Prime Minister's spokesman has made it clear today that the government wants these wrongly convicted postmasters and the other group that took the Post Office to court in 2019 to get their compensation by the end of the summer. So that's not far away. So I think in the short term, certainly the government is going to have to foot the bill, which ultimately is the taxpayer, so you and me. But in the longer term, Alex Chalk, the Justice Secretary, has made it very clear that if and when, as I think it's highly likely, it's found at the end of this inquiry that the Post Office and Fujitsu are at fault, that Fujitsu potentially should be footing the bill. After all, they are a hugely profitable multinational tech firm, Japanese, but based in Bracknell. They have, from 2012 onwards, been given 200 government contracts worth billions of pounds.
Almost 7 billion.
Yeah, the problem is they're really embedded in our sort of systems. For instance, they supply the England's flood defence alerts by them. The Horizon system, by the way, is still operating in post offices even now, and that contract's been renewed to 2025 now. They would have liked to have gone to Amazon, but it's proved too difficult. So the trouble is that although there's a lot of outrage, all this money still being given to them, there's not that many companies that can actually supply it. So you would think, wouldn't you, given all that money that's going their way, if and when they're found to be culpable, surely the government could say, OK, well, you owe us £1 billion has been earmarked for compensation. I think a lot of people will think that why should the taxpayer be footing the bill?
Precisely, and a lot of people can get in touch with us today, Catherine, and yesterday, since this story broke, recently at least, since the drama came out anyway, and they're saying, what about the Post Office workers who prosecuted? They were employed by the Post Office to deliberately try and get guilt found out. 40% compensation schemes, bonuses that Post Office security staff were offered if they successfully prosecuted against some postmasters and mistresses. 40%, that's many thousands of pounds. And people are saying, what does justice look like for these people? If a postmaster is sent to jail, surely there should be similar retribution, similar outcomes for Post Office staff.
So shocking, isn't it? That, you know, the postmasters that they were going after, people that had often worked for the Post Office for decades, that were devoted to their jobs and to their communities. And yet the powers that be in the Post Office seemed very happy to go along with going after them, hundreds of them, rather than investigating the claims that they were making for years and years and years. And bear in mind, it was reported in 2009 in Computer Weekly. There were many reports of faults, problems with this Horizon system, yet the Post Office kept prosecuting people till the mid-2010s. And Paula Venables Post Office boss took that CBE in 2019 when it was widely known. But it really does feel like the big organisations, the big companies, the powers that be will just close ranks, gang up on the ordinary people because they can, and they think that they can get away with it. And we see it time and time again. I mean, this is one of many failures of state. We've had Grenfell, we've had Hillsborough, the tainted blood. You know, people treated atrociously and having to fight for decades, and in many cases still waiting for any form of justice. OK,
Catherine Forster, thank you for that excellent update. But now the day of reckoning has finally arrived. And earlier in the show, I was joined in the studio by Lord James Arbuthnot, and he led an MP's campaign in support of sub-postmasters, and he told me why he got involved.
Was a constituency issue which two sub-postmasters raised with me together. A man from Odium Post Office, David Bristow, and Joe Hamilton from South Warnborough. And there wasn't much I felt I could do. I had a meeting with the Post Office along with another MP who was the MP for Alan Bates. There wasn't much I felt I could do because Jo Hamilton had pleaded guilty, so she obviously couldn't appeal. But then subsequently, David Bristow's replacement as sub-postmaster in Odium was himself removed for exactly the same reasons. And I thought, this is absurd. This is clearly not a coincidence. It is a systemic issue that we've got to deal with. So at that stage, having written previously to the minister and got a reply saying, sorry, it's an arm's length organisation, not us, Gov. Don't trouble me with it. I then wrote again to the minister, but I also wrote to all the MPs to say, do you have a similar sort of problem? And a number of them came back and said, yes, we do.
And so a pattern began to emerge. And at this point, you set up a cross-party group to really set about getting your teeth into this and trying to get justice done.
Yes. And a couple of us went to see the chairman and chief executive of the Post Office, both of them new in post. There was Alice Perkins, who was the chairman, and Paula Vennells, who was the new chief executive. And they really gave the impression that they wanted to clear it up. And they suggested the appointment of forensic accountants, Second Sight, to look into the matter.
And that's Lord Arbuthnot, who joined us in the studio earlier, and one of the instrumental figures pushing for justice for the sub-postmasters. I'm joined now by Heather Wheeler, who's the Conservative MP for South Derbyshire. Welcome to GB News. Heather, always a pleasure. So the inquiry today concluded that the Post Office acted like the mafia, acted like gangsters. What's your take on that?
Well, this is just horrendous. And I'm really pleased that this inquiry was set up about a year ago now by Paul Scully, excellent minister before. It's just getting to the real meat of it now. And every day there is another scandalous expose of what's been going on. And thank goodness for James Arbuthnot and other MPs who had post offices involved at the time.
And Heather, the topic of conversation now, ultimately, obviously, will turn to that compensation Rishi Sunak announced yesterday at PMQs. We can all agree that's the right thing to do. Rumours of £1 billion in potential costs. And the big question is, where does the buck stop? Because I don't think the taxpayer will be very happy if they have to fork out for this.
No, and of course, the post office is owned by all of us, isn't it? So even if the post office pays, one way or another we pay. But it is a profitable company, and if it's their responsibility, then with them. You can go back to Fujitsu, of course you can, and I'm sure that the people who will look at the original contract will look at that as well, and there will be some amount of professional negligence cover, I'm sure. So one way or another, we will get that money back.
And surely that's the logical pursuit. I mean, here's a company worth the thick end of 24 billion quid, Heather. And indeed, over the last decade, the Conservative government has dished out another 200 public contracts worth the thick end of £7 billion. So they're not without a few quid. They've got deep pockets. This happened on their watch. Surely they should be made to cough up.
I sincerely hope so. We do need to find where the buck stops, because I imagine they will say that there were pilots run and that they handed over a perfectly serviceable contract product and the Royal Mail didn't come back to them. Now, that sounds a tad flimsy to me, but we will see. I'm convinced, we believe Fujitsu are at the inquiry next week, so I'm sure more will come out next week.
And Heather, of course, cruel justice was served out for a lot of postmasters and postmistresses who ended up going to jail, having criminal convictions. Would you like to see people jailed at this stage of the inquiry? People from the Post Office, we heard today of a bonus structure. 40% of the money recovered by Post Office security staff was being dangled as bonuses to those who proved the guilt of postmasters. We now know there was no guilt. Should there be prosecutions from that side?
I find this difficult to deal with, because without a doubt there should be a proper process. As much as a knee-jerk reaction is a good idea, I genuinely want the same, no, not the same, I want better processes to find out whether these people should be prosecuted or not. They worked under the auspices of the ethos of the company at the time, and it's very difficult. Hindsight is a horrible, horrible thing sometimes.
Okay, Heather Wheeler, the Conservative MP for South Derbyshire, thank you very much for joining us on GB News.